Go ahead.
This is Taras Kuzio, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Yeah, this is interesting. It's my fault, by the way. I tried to start earlier and I messed the time up. So this is not Terrace's fault. This is Pete's fault. And so I wanted to say that out loud if you were here earlier at 7 and tried to watch with us.
Unlike
One of the things
we accept blame and responsibility.
Yeah, well, you know what? It's better to say that it's my fault because it's my show and I do the booking, and if I don't communicate clearly or if I screw up in the first place, which is probably what happened, it's better just to come out and say it and own it. So, um, one of the things I like, Terrace, about doing this is because we were just talking about this because I've got ground truth and I see what happens when America goes to places and tries to make a better world. Um, we have a pretty shaky record. Now, look, sometimes it works. Like I think America's ability to go to Egypt, Jordan, and Israel and kind of make a stew that seems to work, right? It's taken a long time, but that works. South Korea, aces, right? That's worked pretty well. Obviously, our relationship with Great Britain, like this has all worked well. But Iraq, I mean, not even maybe a D, like a passing grade, but not a very good passing grade. Afghanistan, utter failure. Vietnam has done well, but not because of us. So we have all these things. So when I look at our desire to come and help Ukraine, well, one, with the fight, and two, with reconstruction, man, I don't trust us. But what do you see? I mean, this is your place. This is your world. You're the expert. How do you see us as a partner currently? And when you look ahead, do you trust us?
The answer, my honest answer, would be partially, and that's for all sorts of reasons. Every country has its own national interests. Sometimes they kind of coexist, sometimes they don't. I think the problem that you were referring to really relates to, I would say, kind of ideologically driven policymakers and academics in think tanks in Washington, in particular, who seem to have a one framework for every country, and
Yeah.
and that just doesn't apply. You cannot. I just don't see how you can build a democracy in a poverty-stricken country like Afghanistan. I just don't. I mean, I remember years ago as a student, we were told that there has to be at least a minimum of, like, I don't know, $3, $4, $5,000 per capita per person, in a country. There has to be some kind of economic development for democracy to flourish. And if Afghanistan has been through 4 decades of warfare, conflict, war crimes, it's extremely poor. I just don't see that. So I don't think the Americans going in after 9/11 was a mistake. I think the mistake was trying to do nation building. I mean, the two are separate. I mean, fighting terrorism, Bin Laden had to be killed, right? And the Taliban had to be dealt with. But then staying on and trying to rebuild Afghanistan in a Western image, I think, is a mistake. Iraq is slightly different in that it's a bit like Yugoslavia in that you are trying to build a democracy in an ethnically, mixed country. I think it was a bit odd that many American policymakers didn't realize in 2003 that Iraq is a fake country in many ways, created by the French. Well, it was created by the British and French empires, right? I mean, they just put a ruler on the map, like with a lot of these countries, and they forced into one country 3 ethnic groups: Kurds, Shiites, and Sunnis, who hate each other. I mean, how do you build I mean, in a developed Western democracy, you can create rules to kind of have these 3 groups work together. But as we know, even from the US, it's not that easy to do that. So
let me jump in here too. And then we bottled up in that circling, we bottled up the Turkmen, the Yazidi, the Assyrians,
I mean,
the Chaldeans.
3. I mean, I meant only 3, but there are other smaller groups.
Yeah, I know. It's so crazy, right?
I think with Libya, that was certainly a fundamental mistake, because Look, Gaddafi wasn't pro-Western. He had tried to build a nuclear bomb, but then he dropped that.
Yeah.
And he had supported terrorism, but then he dropped that. But I mean, the what's happened after that? The British, mainly the British, French, and the Americans, got rid of Gaddafi. It led to chaos in the country. The country fell apart. It was taken over partially by ISIS, but most of all, what was worse was that this led to a massive impact of the flowing of refugees to places like Italy, which then increased support for the far right in
Right.
those countries.
Yeah.
So that was a complete mistake. And in the case of Ukraine, there I think we are treading on more firmer ground. A, because this is a European country. B, it's got a record of 30 years of democracy. Yeah, sure, it's not. We haven't reached, Western Europe and the US, but I mean, come on, you guys have been doing it for 200, 300 years. So
Right.
30. Think of what the US was like 30 years after you received independence.
This is a great point. Yes. Right.
So it's moved on. Most of practically every election except one, I think, was declared by international organizations, Western governments, as a freely held democratic election. So you are supporting a democracy. You're also supporting a country in Europe. But I think more from a national security and an American point of view, this isn't just a war with Ukraine. This is a war that is being fought in Ukraine by anti-Western powers, an anti-Western coalition consisting of Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China. And if, I don't think it will happen, but if Ukraine was defeated, then we have serious problems in the West. Then you can basically say the world, which was fashioned in the image of the West and kind of built on Western values after 1945, is over. So this is a war about something far more fundamental. I think most Western governments understand that, but some approach it more differently. I would say you have two groups of countries in the Western world. One is the British, Scandinavians, Poles, Czechs, Baltic states, who openly say that Russia should be militarily defeated and hopefully Putin will go. And then you have a more moderate, weaker group, I would say, led by the US, Germany, France, maybe, which says Ukraine shouldn't be allowed to be defeated, but it never says that Russia should be defeated. And Biden has never said that. The Biden administration has never said that. And this explains the dripping policy of supplying weapons, not all at once. If they had supplied everything that Ukraine has now a year ago or 18 months ago, the war would have been over. But they've drip fed the flow of weapons. They're still debating about whether Ukraine should or should not get F-16s, which is not exactly a new airplane. I mean, it's 30 years old, but it still would have a great impact, but it's not new. And the US is still not allowing this. The Biden administration is still not allowing the sending of long-range missiles, which the British and French are already sending. So I would say the Biden administration is actually quite weak in some ways in its approach. And also, there was an opinion poll published this week in Newsweek, which actually shows that Biden's base is more radical than Biden, because it actually found that a third of Americans would actually support the sending of US troops to Ukraine.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing. I want to back up a little bit too, because
on that, I think Biden is basically a chip off Obama's block, and that's the reason for his moderation. And Obama was a bit of a disaster on international relations.
And this may not resonate or work in Europe, and people may reject this ideologically, but the fact is, Obama was a chip off George Bush the Younger's block. He followed the Bush doctrine, and turned out was the red kill button pushingest president we ever had. He's like, send in the death robot, burp, burp. And I'm not making fun of President Obama, but he really thought like, hey, let's go out and let's get aggressive with this stuff. So it's wild. Couple things.
Well, I think
Yeah.
the thing for your viewers and listeners, what they need to understand, this is not something against the Democrats or the Republicans,
Right,
because
right.
since 1991, there have been, in terms of looking at it from the viewpoint of Ukraine, there have been good Republicans, bad Republicans, and good
Sure.
Democrats and bad Democrats. So, for
Yeah.
example, Bill Clinton was one of the best U.S.
Yeah.
presidents for Ukraine.
Yeah.
Bush Jr. was very good, but Bush Sr. was terrible.
Yeah.
So and Obama wasn't good. Bill Clinton was good. Biden somewhere in the middle between Clinton and Obama.
Yeah.
Trump is just impossible to classify. Because,
He's such a wild card. Yeah.
because for example, Obama vetoed the sending of weapons to Ukraine after 2014, when Ukraine was first invaded, Crimea was occupied, whereas Trump did not veto them.
Right.
So
Yeah.
so it's a very murky, mixed picture. It's more gray usually than black and white.
Yeah.
And
I want to back up and put some color and some context into this, because when we look at us as a partner, there's some things we don't understand.
right.
The distance between Kiev and the capital of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Iran, it's the same distance between Newport Beach, which is down the street from me, and New Orleans, right? We don't realize how connected Ukraine is to all of these parts of the world. And so like they're neighbors. It's a truck drive away. I'm not saying it's an easy ride, but if you wanted to drive that, it's a good hard drive, right? I mean,
Well, for Americans and I lived in Canada for 15 years. Americans and Canadians have a different concept of distance to Europeans. We do it by miles or kilometers. You guys do it by hours. And so for us, a 2-hour drive is a big deal. For you guys, it's just going down the road.
I'm saying a determined person, proximity of flight, right? These places are not that far. I'm not saying a family's going to go, let's go to Tehran for the day. It's not that close.
But psychologically, what's happened in the last 3 decades since the collapse of the Soviet Union is that these 15 republics, or these 27 former communist countries, have drifted apart in different directions. So you're right on the time of travel by airline, but at the same time, psychologically, these countries have just completely gone different ways. And one group, including Ukraine, has moved west psychologically, in Europe-wise. Others have gone way the other direction. Turkmenistan, I don't even know how you classify it. And Russia now is being described as fascist, totalitarian dictatorship. So those countries have really split into two.
From my point of view, when I see a lot of these places, Puerto Rico is a good example. Guam is a good example. You sort of have our Native Americans are a good example. You have the status quo folks, you have the reject the Americans, and then you have the let's stay pure and let's stay, Uzbek. Don't do anything external, right? So does that, when we talk about being Western, and then the West would look at, like, say, Libya, right, or Ukraine, we'd say, if you're not with us, you're against us, and that eliminates like 2/3 of that equation, right? So if you're a Ukrainian businessman who's focused on everything to the east, the West would go, oh, well, you're with the Russians, and in reality, you're like, I'm just working with my neighbors. You're not pro or against. You get what I'm saying? And so it's very easy. And I'm an intel guy. It's very easy to find yourself being contrary to the U.S., where you're like, I just don't care about you all. I'm over here working with my neighbors. I may not like them, but these are my business partners because of proximity.
there certainly was aspects of trade between Russia and Ukraine up till 2014, particularly on the including on the energy side. That's
Right.
all gone. That's all completely gone
Okay.
since 2014, and two factors really here. Firstly, the Russian invasion. Secondly, um, Ukraine signed an association agreement with the European Union in 2014. This was one of the things that Russia tried to oppose, tried to prevent, hence the popular uprising called the Euromaidan Revolution. And the signing the association agreement meant that Ukraine was let into the biggest customs union in the world, the European Union. And that completely changed the orientation and dynamic of Ukrainian trade, moved it eastwards to westwards, which is positive not only from the viewpoint of national security, but it's also positive from the viewpoint that Russia doesn't give a damn whether you're corrupt and whether there's dodgy things happening, whereas the EU demands certain standards, both in the quality of what you're selling, but also that this has to be done without any corrupt practices. And my joke is always that Russia's biggest export isn't oil and gas, it's corruption. Russia's weaponized corruption. And in every Western capital, including Washington, you had Russia buying up politicians, political consultants, lawyers, you name it, working for them. So when you reduce the amount of trade, particularly in the energy sector with Russia, you also then have a big positive impact in reducing corruption in your country. I mean, Russia, the Russian export of corruption was everywhere in Europe, and in the US, they were buying up real estate, particularly in Florida and places like this. So that has happened, and Ukraine since 2014 is energy independent of Russia, and the EU only became energy independent of Russia after Russia's invasion. It's incredible that they continued, particularly this gas pipeline called Nord Stream, which was from Russia to Germany. Trump sanctioned it. Then Biden, when he came,
sanctioned in a good way or a bad way, just so we all are clear.
It's a good way because this basically, first of all, it exported corruption into Germany, and secondly, it meant that Russia controlled energy supplies to Europe's biggest economy, Germany. Trump imposed sanctions, which I think was positive. When Biden was elected in 2020, he removed those sanctions, and then when Russia invaded, they were reimposed. I know he wanted to improve relations with Germany, but that was Germany was mistaken to continue building Nord Stream after 2014. I think that one of the areas that we can certainly discuss and I would write about, is the weakness of Western sanctions in the past, after the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014. This weakness of the West sent a signal to Moscow that it can do it again and get away with it. And of course, it didn't get away with it in 2022. The West imposed Iranian-style sanctions on Russia. But that was the first time. Those Iranian-style sanctions were not imposed on Russia in 2008 or 2014, only in 2022. So, for example, Nord Stream was only cancelled by Germany in 2022, not in 2014. So Russia miscalculated, but it miscalculated in the Western reaction because of West's weakness before. And that I think is because Russia always believed Russia and China believed the West is weak, divided. This is their stereotype of because they don't understand Western democracies. They assume that because we
think we're weak and divided.
Yeah,
we agree, but in a different way.
We can quarrel and argue, but fundamentally, you're still an American patriot.
How does at all Armenia and Azerbaijan, yeah, because Azerbaijan's jumping in on Armenia, and I'm looking at this in a negative way about the Azerbaijanis. But does that tie into this? I mean, look, this is a Eurasian conflict. Is this? Are they all just jumping into the fray?
Well,
I mean, you can say it's genocidal and everything. It's pretty horrible, right?
well, you've got to be. I've got to be careful in my answer to you because you live in California, which has a massive, powerful Armenian lobby.
And they are fun to party with.
Well, I can imagine that. Um, and their biggest lobbies in the West are in America, probably California mostly,
Yeah.
and France. But what we have to realize is Armenia is very pro-Russian as a country. I mean, there's obviously historical factors for
Sure.
that. You know, it's in an area on the west, it's bordered by Turkey. On the east, it's bordered by Azerbaijan. And so it has 3 Russian military bases. It has very strong military ties to Russia, and it's a member of Russian-led economic and military security structures. Now, Azerbaijan is in this sense more pro-Western because it's strongly linked to Turkey, and it exports a lot of its energy to Europe. So the Armenian, I think one of the problems we have seen in the past is that we look at the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict through our own internal biases, Christians and Muslims.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's wrong. I'll give you 2 reasons why it's wrong. You'll be surprised, and I think your viewers and listeners will be surprised to hear that one of the strongest allies Azerbaijan has is Israel. Nobody kind of goes, "What? Are you serious?"
Yeah.
It really is the case. And there's a lot of rumors that a lot of the actions taken, in secret operations undertaken by Israel against Iran, are done from Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan and Israel have had a military relationship, strategic military relationship, since at least the 2000s. And one of the reasons why that's possible is that Azerbaijan is a Shiite country, but extremely secular. So, so this is a legacy of the Soviet Union. I mean, most people are not staunch, ardent Muslims. So in that sense, they're even more secular than Turkey, which is relatively secular as well. And Azerbaijan today is quite pro-Ukrainian, whereas Armenia, and I've written about this, so your viewers and listeners can find things by me on the internet. Armenia has actually been helping Russia in its war against Ukraine by there are 2 or 3 countries which are helping Russia evade Western sanctions, and that's Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Iran. And the way we know this has been happening is that for some reason in 2022, the volume of trade in Armenia, for example, has just gone through the roof. And this can't be because their economy has just gone, become so good. It's because stuff is being re-exported, particularly like electronics, re-exported to Russia through Georgia, which is basically Armenia, Georgia, then Russia. What you kind of have in that neighborhood is 2 kind of regional alliances, which is Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, Iran, and Russia. So, what happened 3 years ago was a war that broke out after a conflict had been frozen for 25 years or so, and Azerbaijan won that. The reason why it won it, again, is interesting because its military and its weapons were Western. And so its training was done by NATO countries like Turkey, by the US. Israel supplied a lot of its weapons, including drones, Turkey as well, whereas Armenia had Russian military training and Russian weapons. And the analogy is the same with Russia-Ukraine. One of the reasons why Ukraine is defeating a much bigger country like Russia is Western training and Western weapons. So it's the same kind of situation there. These things tend to be always more complicated than they are
Oh,
than in the
yeah.
first.
One of the greatest things I learned from talking to different folks in Europe he's now a general in Finland, and he's like, there are many Europes, and
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
like, oh my God, like even
yeah.
within Turkey, it is
Yeah,
its own Europe. You know,
yeah.
it's
This is why when you ask the question about what is it to be a Westerner or a European, well,
uh,
we have a very broad umbrella,
right.
uh, and Western democracies are very varied,
Yeah.
both in the way they hold democracies.
Mhm.
For example, in about half of U.S. states, you don't allow people who have been criminally convicted to ever vote again.
Right.
Um, um, and that just by coincidence, of course, they tend to be in the US South. Whereas we don't have that anywhere else. I lived in Canada. Canada is just to the north of you, but it's very different in terms of its politics. It's more
Yeah.
European and very British in its judicial system compared to the US. So we have a multiplicity of different
Mhm.
types of democracies. They're all democracies, and they also therefore approach issues of national minorities and differences quite differently. Some are quite, I would say, staunchly nationalistic in that they demand assimilation, like the French. The
Yeah.
French, you have no choice. You have to become a French speaker. Um,
Yes.
others are more liberal. Britain's become more liberal in that sense. Um, for example, Wales has a big flowering of the Welsh language and culture in the last 20 years. So there's a variety, a major
Yeah.
variety amongst the West, but fundamentally we all hold similar values.
Right.
And one of the things that comes out of this war is the value of life. I mean, you just look at the way Ukrainian soldiers approach this, and Ukrainian commanders and the Ukrainian president, where life is sacrosanct, and the way the Russian leaders don't give a flying monkeys about how many people are
Right.
killed. They
Yeah.
just don't care, including their. I'm not just talking about Ukrainians, including their own soldiers and their own people.
Right.
They just
Yeah.
don't care.
Which is
Uh,
on theme for them for 100 plus years. I mean, they
yeah,
don't
yeah,
care.
yeah.
Yeah.
Nothing's changed. Ukraine's
Yeah.
moved on. Russia under Putin hasn't moved on. It's regressed. Um,
Yeah.
they have over 200,000 military casualties. That's dead, killed,
Shocking. Yeah.
wounded, and POWs.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Glad
shocking.
glad to
That's
do
shocking.
double that. Glad to do it. Just yeah. I wanted to. You were talking about Russian corruption, and there's no argument here. Like we know that this is the thing with those guys, and I got to be honest. Well, let me back up and let's get into Ukrainian corruption a little bit. One of the reasons why there's not F-16s is because the Ukrainian leadership is asking for too much cream on top of those jets, right? They want to get paid to get those jets, and the Americans are like, that's not going to get paid. There's plenty of money to be made in service contracts, and it can be Ukrainians that make that money, and it wasn't good enough. And so when we have these deals and the Ukrainians are demanding graft up front, Americans just aren't going to do it, right? At least not the Americans that are in the room right now, maybe down the road, but everybody's got to get elected in this country. Everybody's got to keep their job. And so when the Ukrainians ask for too much because that's their default and they think that's what we're going to do, that level of corruption isn't sustainable. And when I read the news, I see a lot of problems. And look, I know Ukraine is working on it, right? And I know they're in a different time in their establishment of how they run their country. But when I see what looks like corruption in the courts and other areas, you think, man, how do I trust that? Okay, now, so there's that premise of how do we suss out what is and isn't corrupt? And then we're still America. We're still going to come with a lot of money. We're still going to be a corrupting force. We're still going to have people funding think tanks. We're still going to have, and you and I both know this is true, there's still people in America that are going to play their pony and try to carve up Ukraine in some way that benefits them. Because they're like, if we play our cards right, this will work out for the good of Ukraine, and I will get money because there's a lot of potential in Ukraine if we can get it stabilized. So let's not be easy on America, because I believe there are a lot of people that stand to gain a lot of money if it works out in the way they want to work it. And so they work it in the press, they work it, there's a lot of things going on with that.
I think one of the things that should be defined is the difference between corruption and what Russia has been described as, going as far back as 2010, which is a mafia state.
Fair enough. Okay.
The first time I ever found Russia was defined like that was 2010. It's available in one of those leaked US diplomatic cables, WikiLeaks. You can go find it. Just do a search. And I think the difference is that corruption is found in most countries. It's just one of the human fallacies, right? I mean, I don't think that's. I even tweeted a few days ago that post-communist countries have corruption, Western countries have consultancy fees.
Yeah.
But a mafia state is very different. That's when there's no difference between organized crime and the government. They're in bed together. And corruption, thank God, Russia is a mafia state, because that's one of the major reasons the Russian army is so terrible today. If there wasn't corruption, or Russia wasn't a mafia state, Russia could be very well winning this war. But it can't, and it can't resolve this overnight. You're talking 10 years to deal with this and sacking the entire Russian officer corps. Just the state of the supply system to the army.
It's terrible.
It's terrible. I mean, it's just corruption. And the reason why these lower-ranking soldiers are looting everything they can find in Ukraine is because of the example they see from their own officers.
Right.
They're saying, if they can steal, well, I want a slice of the action, and so they go and steal as much as they can. The only problem is when they've sent it back through Belarusian post offices to Russia, half of that was stolen on the way by post office workers. So yes, there is that difference. In the case of Ukraine, I think one of the pluses here is that the relatively newly elected president in 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky, doesn't have that corruption baggage. So I've never actually seen a single article in Ukraine or in a Western publication which has pointed the finger at Zelensky and said he's got his fingers in the pie. So that shows a kind of a difference to previous leaders, many of who did make money in that Wild West rush to capitalism in the 1990s, when it was like a complete Wild West in these countries. Okay. Zelensky wasn't involved in that. He's a self-made man. And so that's a plus. Is there going to be still continuing corruption? Of course there is. He's just sacked, about a week ago, he sacked all the heads of local enlistment officers, because some of them were taking bribes for men who didn't want to be enlisted to go to the army. But I think that I think most Western governments, including the US, are quite happy with Zelensky they don't see him as this corrupt mafia don, and that's a big major plus. In terms of what's being sent, I think there's two things which are being sent. On the one hand, you have military assistance. That's not really money. It's training, supplies like shells, and it's military equipment. So Ukraine's not getting any physical money. But on the other side, from Western governments, US, IMF, European Union, other European governments, Ukraine is getting financial help to keep its government afloat, because there's something like $5 billion deficit gap each month caused by the war and caused by Russia's blockade of Ukrainian trade.
Right.
I haven't seen to date that anybody has pointed the finger and said this money's gone astray. So that there must be some kind of
give them time.
Well, sure, but there seem to be some controls there. I mean, the populist Republican Party is calling for greater controls over the sending of military equipment to Ukraine, that's fine.
Yeah.
Again, I've not heard of stuff being sold off, that's being sent to Ukraine.
Look, let me ask you a really pointed question though.
Yeah.
Would it all surprise you that President and I'm all for President Zelensky. If not him, then who else would it be, right? I'm all for him. But would it not surprise you that he was more substantially more wealthy today than he was 2 years ago, despite the war?
I would be very surprised to hear that because his only salary in the last 2 years has been his presidential pay.
Okay,
Uh,
all right, yeah.
and
Well, okay. Then is it fair to say that people would?
But I mean, he accumulated money in the private sector
Yeah.
as
Okay.
a TV
Yeah.
star
Yeah.
up to the 2019 election. So
Yeah.
he probably has quite a bit of property. I think he has a property in Italy, I think.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so, but that was money he made in the private
We're not
sector.
talking about private sector money. I mean, yes,
No,
since he
no,
became
no.
president.
I would be very surprised, and I'm not.
Okay.
I follow the Ukrainian media, and Ukraine has a free media. It's a democracy. He has a
Right.
free media, and they would have some investigative journalist would have found something by now if that was true.
All right.
So I haven't
Yeah.
heard that at all.
Well, that's good to hear, right? Because the assumption is going to be until he opens up his files, and then even then we're gonna be like, I don't believe it, right? It's just we have seen so much graft. We just assume that it's always there. Like our U.S. representatives all get rich, hundreds of millions of dollars, and you're like, how are you doing that? And they're like, I swear I'm honest. You're like, how can it be on
So
a,
as I joked, consultancy fees, right?
yeah, right. Yeah, yeah. They become fabulously wealthy. So, that's a norm here, and we're not corrupt, right? And so we just sort of
Well,
like, of course.
This is the problem of there is a very well-known think tank, I think run out of Germany. It's very well known as a think tank dealing with corruption called Transparency International. And one of their problems with their rankings is that they only rank the source of the corrupt money, say Russia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
They don't rank where the money's sent.
Yeah.
And in Europe, I'm not even talking about the US, but in Europe, there's a whole bunch of countries like Cyprus, Malta, Austria, where there's tons of this money comes in.
Yeah. Yep.
I mean, they used to joke that London should be nicknamed Londongrad because there were so many Russian oligarchs there, and of course they were buying properties,
Yeah.
for millions of dollars with these proceeds. So how come the source of this money in those countries was led to those countries having a poor ranking as very corrupt, but not the countries that took this dirty money? They were not ranked badly. So you're only really looking at one side of a corrupt equation. So, for example, if I robbed a store I would be sent to jail, but then if I'd have already given the money, say to you, you'd have been okay.
Yeah.
I mean, so we do have this kind of double standards that we love to point the finger elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
President Biden his home state of Delaware is one of the 2 or 3 states in the U.S. which makes money from the selling of companies online, and these companies are used to launder money. Yeah, exactly. I totally agree with campaigning against corruption, but I'm a bit skeptical about the double standards that we have. I have actually written about, I even called it based on the Netflix series House of Cards, about the number of people in Washington who were making money from overseas governments. I mean, you had legislation from the late 1930s called FARA, Foreign Agent Registration Act, which wasn't being implemented by the Department of Justice. It only began to be implemented in the last 10 years when Paul Manafort was put in jail.
Right.
He was making tons of money in Ukraine, but not declaring it in the US.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then, he made money in Ukraine, then he became Trump's campaign manager, then he went to jail.
Yeah.
Uh, so, so before we point the finger, let's clean up our own houses.
Yeah, and I don't want to stray too far into the Trump Biden world because that warps all reality and that gets us so far from where we need to be, right? But I
Absolutely.
definitely, when people think that the U.S. doesn't at least feed and empower corruption, I got to tell them from the ground truth, I've seen it, and I've seen foreign aid come in and there be no accountability. And one thing I know for sure, and look, I'm not pointing a finger at Pinchuk, right? The businessman, oligarch, whatever we want to call him. But because he does things that Americans like, and because he likes Jeff Koons is this modern art person, everybody. He does those giant balloon animals.
Hmm.
We like that dude. And so he's our kind of guy. And
Hmm.
so because we get him, he's okay. But he'll go to a gala, he'll cut a check, he's okay. Doesn't matter what he does outside of
Clinton
that.
Library. He gave to the Clinton Library.
Right. See, this is how you play the game. If you go do business and you're like, I turn dirt into whatever it's going to be, right? Um, we don't like that guy because he's not Western. So one of the questions I have for you: when we went to Iraq, we fired everybody, all the Baathists. We kicked them all out. And we didn't want them around. And then I'm running around afterwards, and I'm like, "What's going on?" They're like, "Well, that refinery, that plant used to employ all of these people, and it wasn't tribe, it was people, and now everything's tribal. And the guy that runs it, he was the cobbler, and let me tell you, he wasn't even the best cobbler. And so this guy, so we took a guy who was educated at the London School of Economics, but because he was a Baptist and he knew how to run this place, and he was on the wrong team that got turned over. Now we have a guy there who was just like we were talking about earlier. He's like, store's open, take what you want. And so the refinery, the plant, whatever. And I saw this, Terrace, I saw this over and over and over again. I am afraid that we are going to pick the wrong people. And even, and we, there's a great story of the day in the New York Times where President Zelensky is like, I do not like this arms dealer, and I'm going to try to say his name best. Pashinsky is his name, right? But it turns out Pashinsky knows the right people to get the right caliber of weapons, and so you're unfortunately stuck with this guy, even if you don't like him. And so we have these things where you go, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if we like him, if he's corrupt or whatever it is, because he knows how to get the job done. And we have a lot of these people in Ukraine where there's old grudges. There are old relationships with the old Soviets scattered across all of these different districts and provinces from the Soviet Union. So how do we deal with this, man? How do we take the people that know how to make money, know how to employ people, know how to make things, and when appropriately, get away from it? How do we avoid state raiding of assets so that we keep the right people out there so that Ukraine can pick itself up? Because we had Richard Epstein on the show the other day. I don't know if you know who Richard is, but Richard's a fantastic economist, and he'll tell you if you get out of the economy's way, it will heal itself faster than anything else. And so, how do we do that when we have a bunch of folks who are not inclined to do that in America?
Well, the Pashinsky case, which you brought up,
Yeah,
well, I mean, let's all remember that the whole arms trade in the world is a very murky business anyway,
yeah,
and
right.
every Western government's been involved in it in various ways. For example,
Necessary evil. Yeah,
supplying proxy forces in various countries. You don't want your government to be seen doing it, so you do it through middlemen,
right.
which are these arm traders. Now, there would have been no reason for Pashinsky to be involved in the beginning of 2022 when Russia invaded if the West had given the weapons to Ukraine that Ukraine needed. But
Hmm.
the problem was that majority of people, including in the Pentagon and in Western European governments, were convinced that Ukraine wouldn't last more than 3 or 4 days. That they had been they had come to believe their own or drunk their own Kool-Aid.
Yeah,
Yes, Russian military had done reforms. Yes, the Russian military was powerful. Yes, the Russian military is the second best or second most powerful in the world after the US. This was all obviously wrong. And they were wrong about Ukraine's ability to resist. But that was the general viewpoint. And therefore, because of that, no Western government sent heavy weapons to Ukraine. The only weapons they sent were weapons that they thought Ukrainians could use in a guerrilla war
Mm,
against the Russian occupation. So things like javelins and stingers. So that was the only thing that Ukraine was getting when Russia invaded. And so therefore you needed Pashinsky to get other stuff. Now, he would have not been needed if all the stuff that the West subsequently sent had been sent at the beginning.
yeah,
So I mean, you kind of blaming Ukraine or Pashinsky for your own inability to. I mean, how did all these experts in Washington at these various think tanks get the Russian army so wrong? I've actually written articles about this. I mean,
yeah,
they got it completely wrong, and they completely ignored the state of the Russian mafia state and its influence, negative influence on the state of the Russian military. But that was the only reason why the West desisted from sending heavy weapons. I mean, look how it's taken them 18 months to send tanks and HIMARS and everything else. Now, in terms of
I just want to say this because,
yeah,
and I'm not in any way defending the U.S. If I took 10 military experts, I would get 10 totally different opinions to what you just said, and
yeah,
they would all disagree with each other. Oh my God, it is very in everybody's defense. This is all very complex, and I love that you're talking about this because you're nailing the nail on the nail right on the head because it is so hard and so often. This is why I always say whenever the West shows up, we bring instability with us, right? And so we make, in this case, your premise, and I'm not going to argue with it because I don't see why we could. We make Pashinsky legitimate, and we maybe force Zelensky's hand in this premise, right? Which
well,
we make
you're in a
stability.
bind, right? Russia's
Yeah,
invaded, massive
yeah,
invasion.
yeah,
Uh, well, you really don't really care where the weapons come from or how they get to you
right,
because you're defending yourself not only against an invasion but a genocidal invasion because the
right,
invasion has been accompanied by war crimes on a massive scale.
yeah.
So I'm sorry, your niceties about where these weapons come from go out of the window in that situation.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, I mean, I'm sure he's not in business today, Pashinsky, because the West now is sending stuff on a more regular scale for the last year or so. But look at all of the
I
drip
mean,
feed.
until they need, the Russian series ammo again, I mean, and we don't have it for whatever reason,
Well,
like our warehouse would.
I read just today or yesterday that the whole shell question seems to have been resolved. I don't, I we
Yeah,
obviously don't know all the details, but I think the U.S. there's some plants in Pennsylvania apparently that produce these shells. The U.S. and Europe have come together to supply Ukraine with the
yeah,
shells. I mean, they're using these shells on an industrial scale,
yeah,
which
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, the positive spin off from this is that Western countries, including the US, are now more prepared for any eventuality down the road, including a war with China or over Taiwan or something else,
Yeah,
because Western economies were not prepared for that war
yeah.
uh, until the Ukrainian invasion.
And the Russian economy now less so, right? Yeah,
The Russian economy is a shambles. I mean, we've seen the collapse of the ruble currency in
right.
the last week, and
So let's go back to these industrialists, these people that do unsexy work like make bleach, deal with ammonia, mine, scrape, and turn very, very raw things into vital things that everybody needs around the world, right? And some of this stuff we can do during war, some of it can't because of the location and everything. But these are unsexy jobs that take very specific things, and state rating is a thing. It's going to be a thing, and we don't know who should and shouldn't do it. There are grudges to be made. Look, they fight this stuff in the press. I read some of these stories, man, and I got to tell you, I know a lot about psychological operations because, I've got peers that do that stuff. I see a lot of bullshit. I see a lot of things where people are settling scores in the media. So how do we know who we're working with? And then how do we know when we should just get out of the way and follow Epstein's advice? And Epstein's really smart. So how do we do this?
well, I'm not sure. Again, we're delving into an area which is quite murky because it's not really black and white. But I'm not
Right.
sure that the government can completely take its hands off the economy in a war situation.
Right.
I mean, the U.S. in World War II, I'm sure the government was far more involved in the economy than it would be in peacetime.
Yeah.
So I think he's right up to a point, but a lot of this will wait until after the war's finished. I mean, what the war has done in Ukraine is in some ways what we did to our heavy industries in the 80s. I remember Britain, and I'm sure the US was the same. The heavy industries of the past, like iron, steel, coal,
Yeah.
were all kind of closed down. I'll never forget the great movie Deer Hunter in Pennsylvania, the big steel factories.
Hmm.
They're all gone, like they're gone
Yeah.
in Britain. Ukraine, they were still churning stuff out.
Yeah.
They're all destroyed by Russia's war, because a lot of them were based in the eastern part of Ukraine.
Right.
So, ironically, the war is actually modernizing Ukraine. It's moving it from that old style industry, which was inherited from the USSR, to more modern. And Ukraine's a big, quite advanced in the whole field of IT.
Sure.
And this is again a product of the fact that in the Soviet Union, Ukraine had a massive military-industrial complex. It had the biggest plant in the world that made nuclear weapons, and that needed IT specialists. It needed people working in research laboratories doing all this cybernetics and all this other stuff. And the IT sector has actually not collapsed since the war began. It keeps going up. Where it's impossible to understand, and I do follow the Ukrainian economy, is that last year the Ukrainian economy collapsed because of the war and invasion by 1/3. That's a massive collapse.
Yeah.
This year, the projections from IMF and elsewhere is that the economy in Ukraine is going to grow by 2.53%. So figure that one out.
Yeah.
I can't.
Yeah.
So
I can't either.
Epstein's right that basically the economy is adjusting
Right. Yeah.
to the war.
Yeah.
So I mean, the one area where I think Russia's trying to block that readjustment is in trying to prevent Ukraine from trading through the Black Sea. I mean, Ukraine's response is to attack Russian ships to prevent Russia exporting them.
Yeah.
Attack. So that's one area that is still ongoing, as it were, because Ukraine was a massive exporter of grain to Africa and places like that.
Yeah.
But no, IT is going to be a big player in Ukraine, and this war is, I'm sure, being watched in the Pentagon and NATO and elsewhere, because it's changing the face of war.
It is. It is. Yeah.
Just to give you an example, Ukraine is using cheap drones, which cost I don't know,
Off the shelf.
off the shelf, and a few $1,000s each, to destroy Russian military equipment, which costs 10-15 million.
You could take an RKG-3 and a drone. RKG-3 is an anti-tank grenade, everybody, with the pin, and just drop it, and you could reliably terrify, not even successfully kill tanks, but they would have to deal with you.
Well, if that grenade goes inside the turret and explodes the shells, then
it's an anti-armored tank. So, like, if you get over the top in the soft spot, it's terrifying what that would do, and it would stop a column until they dealt with it. It's crazy.
So this war has many sides.
Yeah, it's really changed things.
And I think there's a lot that we are going to be studying about this war for years to come.
One of the things that I wonder about, and look, you know so much about this because you understand like the different ideologies and social classes, especially in the Americas, and I'll throw Canada in here too. And a lot of our the folks that work on the policy side and get the degrees from Georgetown and Kennedy School of Government, I'm hard on these folks, and they deserve it because they've got expensive degrees, and they often come in. And Epstein and I talked about this yesterday. They come in too smart, and they don't have answers a lot of times. So these guys come in and they've got a lot of marks in their background, not a judgment, just a fact. And so they don't like it when people make money on war. They don't like billionaires. They don't like people that do well through entrepreneurial spirit, right? They don't. Their solutions are things like co-ops, and they want to teach Ukrainian farmers how to farm, and they want to bring drip irrigation to Iraqi farmers. And green, I'm struggling to even say it with a straight face. They have these ridiculous solutions to problems that no one's like saying, hey, we have a problem with water here next to the damn Tigris River, right? And so I fear that we won't be able to help ourselves, and we'll be telling Ukrainian farmers that they need shared robot. I'm inventing stuff, but they'll have something like the shared robot tractors that you all have to use, and we're going to spend all this money doing it because I've seen us do it, whether it's farming or rule of law or all these other areas, and we will do what we can to penalize people that are successful, whether they're successful because of the war or if they were successful before the war. We will target these people and try to tear them down because obviously they're part of the problem. I just know that we'll do this because we don't like that. And the economists, like the Epsteins and the Souls of the world, who are like, hey, leave the people that have been good at business alone, and they are going to help drive the economy. It's going to repair faster. We will ignore those people and disparage those people. And we tend to fail here in America at getting this stuff right. So I'm worried about that. So talk to me a little bit about what you think, and how do we learn to shut up and get out of. One of the things Epstein said is like, how do we shut up and get out of the way, and then help where we can and reliably go, oh, all you need is a little bit of fertilizer. Oh yeah, okay. How do we do that, right?
Well, I mean, I think that the process was already beginning with Zelensky when dealing with what in the West we have called oligarchs, and by oligarchs, the negative reputation as
Sure.
basically people living off their close ties to the government,
Is
creaming
there
up.
a billionaire in Ukraine who's not an oligarch?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think so. But I mean, the thing is, I mean, those oligarchs are now finished. I mean, they're gone. They don't exist anymore because the wealthiest oligarch in Ukraine had most of his industry in the area which has been destroyed the most by Russian invasion in the
Yeah.
east. Guy called Rinat Akhmetov.
Okay.
In Chuk, I have not heard a dicky thing about him since the invasion began. He's probably quiet in living in London or one of his other
Right.
houses. Um, Kolomoisky, another oligarch, Zelensky took away his citizenship and kicked him out of the country. So he's probably living in Israel or Switzerland. He had three passports. I think that the oligarchs were already on their way out,
Mm.
um, or they're just simply over. And what needed to be done, and it was too long in coming, was transforming um, uh, oligarchs who were corrupt into normal big businessmen,
Mm.
into entrepreneurs. And that, I think, that has now happened, or we're in the process of it happening. So I'm not that worried that say if the war ended tomorrow, that these corrupt oligarchs would come back and continue to rule the show. One of the areas they, for example, controlled and therefore controlled the political process and elections was TV channels, and they've pretty much lost control of those TV channels now, which are quite independent. So on the question of America kind of telling Ukrainians what to do, I think that what we have in many ways is actually a two-way process. And as I just mentioned, there's a lot of Westerners, Western policymakers, military people, intelligence people, I'm sure as well, are keeping a close eye on the war and learning a lot, and they will be applying this to Western armies afterwards. So, we don't hear about it, but I'd be very surprised if Western intelligence people are not in Ukraine, in Kiev, and elsewhere, and not just soaking up all of this experience that Ukraine is having in the war with Russia, because that is important to NATO members if they ever have to go to war with Russia, right? So they need that. They're basically learning all the weak spots of the Russian army that will help NATO defeat Russia in the future, if there ever is going to be a war between
Yeah.
both. So I think that the learning process is two ways. The Ukrainians are very happy to go and get trained in the West, and
Sure.
quite a few countries have been training Ukrainian troops, because that training is far better than what the Russians get. The difference between Russia and Ukraine stroke NATO is the Russian system is all vertical, all hierarchical.
Yeah. Right.
So if it's a group of soldiers whose officer gets killed, they're hopeless, they're useless, they have no idea what to do. And they don't have NCOs. Whereas Ukrainians, like NATO, US troops, are trained to be adaptable, to be autonomous. They don't have to ring up headquarters and say, "What the hell do we do now?"
Right. Yes. Yeah.
And you have that. So it's often compared to a kind of a horizontal versus a vertical war.
Right.
Ukraine's being the horizontal, and the Ukrainians are taking that training and Western military equipment, but they're also they've been described and credited with being very resilient and adapting that to Ukrainian war circumstances. Because I think one of the criticisms Ukraine had with this current counteroffensive was that the US was training them to fight as if they were in Afghanistan or Iraq. And the war in Ukraine is not like that. This is not a counterinsurgency war. This is a real war, a proper war between two armies. It's not a counterinsurgency. Therefore, you're talking, you need different tactics and different strategies. So I tend to find that there is a kind of a give and take on both sides. Because let's face it, many Western countries are just stunned by what is going on still. It's still quite unbelievable to see a war on this scale in the 21st century in Europe. It's mind-boggling, right?
Shocking. Yeah. John Spencer is a guy from America who focuses on modern urban warfare, and he was already ahead of all of us, and now he is like way out in front, and they invite him out all the time, and he is already changing how we see all of this fight. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. I'll link you to him, but he is. I'll link you guys on Twitter. He is invaluable, and he's always there. And he comes back and he teaches, and he comes back. If that guy alone is going to change how these two countries relate, and he's going to be a difference maker potentially on the historic level. So, hey, I have one final question. I know we're a little bit over an hour, but one of my favorite things to do is to say, okay, I'm going to give you like the wheel of change or the switch of change. So you can go to President Biden and he's like, you can make one change, Harris. What dial do you want to change? What switch do you want to flip? How do you want to impact how America does this whole thing with Ukraine right now today? Any switch, any change you want? What do you want to do?
Yeah, my response would be stop drip feeding the supply of weapons to Ukraine. Give everything that you've got. And the last two areas that you've refused to give are these long-range missiles, and which the French and British have already given, and the jets. Give them it and declare openly up front that you desire the military defeat of Russia and the victory of Ukraine. Say that up front. It's psychologically very important. Therefore, you're coming on board with like Britain, Scandinavia, Poland, Czech Republic, the Baltic states. And then the Germans don't have anybody to hide behind, because the Germans hide behind the US position here, like always. There needs to be a clarity. At the moment, there are these two groups, the sort of the hawks, if you want to call it that, the doves. And there needs to be one Western position that Russia needs to be militarily defeated. And that will lead to a change of regime in Moscow. Putin cannot survive military defeat. And then we'll have maybe a different environment. Then maybe peace talks can be held, and Russia will be a different country. We want Russia to change, but Russia can only change after Russia is militarily defeated and Putin goes. And Russia historically has always moved towards democracy after military defeats, for example, in 1905, 1917. And that would be good for us in the West as well. This kind of slow drip feeding is bad for the West and bad for Ukrainians and only good for Russia. Because
Yeah.
Putin doesn't care about Russian human life. So he's going to keep sending cannon fodder to die in Ukraine, hoping that eventually the West tires out.
Yeah.
We need to finish this as quickly as possible, and the only way to do that is to give the Ukrainians everything that they want. They'll finish the job, and they'll defeat Russia, and then we can have a different Europe, no more war, and no more, hopefully, Vladimir Putin causing problems around the world. It will also be a major, major blow to China. I think what's important for the populist wing of the Republican Party to realize is that you cannot park Russia and deal with China, because all of these countries are as part of one alliance. The alliance is North Korea, China, Iran, and Russia. And you need to deal with them as one group, not as a separate group. If and when Russia is defeated in Ukraine, that will make China hesitate from invading Taiwan. And so
I thought you were going to say Trump was the answer.
Trump has about as much knowledge about international affairs as my first year undergrad student.
I tell you now, anybody who wants to vote for somebody, just vote for me. I'll do a better job than those guys will. I'll just I won't be those guys. I won't be either of those two guys. That's
I've met narcissistic guys in the past, but this guy.
Oh my God. Yeah. Any final thought before I push this button and turn this show off? Anything else?
No, I think that we need to have clarity in the U.S. position, and that clarity should be that Ukraine needs to be given everything it needs to defeat Russia.
Yeah.
And the American goal is the military defeat of Russia. And to prevent this happening again, the only way to do that is to bring Ukraine into NATO after the war ends. Because once Ukraine is in NATO, Russia will not be tempted down the road after it's defeated and rebuilt its army to try it again. So you need to get rid of that gray zone, which Ukraine was in between the two blocks. So give everything Ukraine needs, say out loud Russia should be militarily defeated, end the war, have peace talks, bring Ukraine to NATO. Do that, and then we'll have resolved it, and the West would have been victorious over this anti-Western alliance.
If Pete was president, he'd pick up this phone. The ball was already moving, by the way. The ball's already thrown. And I'm like, hey, man, I'm talking to Putin. Listen, I'd like this whole war to be over real fast. And so what I want you to do is come to the table, sit down, we'll work something out. We'll go back to basically where we started this whole thing. And if you can get down with that, cool. Let's set a date. We'll go to Yalta or wherever you want. You guys pick the spot. I'll come. We'll sign some papers. Everybody will get along fine. And we'll agree to that in advance. If not, shit's already going to happen. It's going to get nasty and it's going to get really ugly for you in the next 10 minutes. Let me know your answer. Call me back. Hang up. And that's it. And then you just get nasty and you do send those long range missiles and they're already en route. Everything's already in play. And you just, you make it nasty. You're like, look, I'm tired of playing this game. You're going to get balled up and punched in the mouth, and you just stop because people are getting killed for no damn reason anymore.
Yes. I mean, and including Russian people.
Look, families are being destroyed. I know what it looks like on the ground. Women are going to get raped. They're going to be brutalized. If we care about the environment, nothing is worse for the environment than a stupid war.
They blew up. I was in Ukraine in June, and they blew up this massive dam, which will take decades to deal with the consequences of that. That was the biggest example of environmental terrorism the world has ever seen. So we have to prevent this.
Yeah. I want to, or you know what? Just go like mano a mano, you and me, Putin. Let's go out there and we'll go out and we'll choke each other until one of us taps and quits, and then that'll be it. We'll just do champion style. But I'd like to put an end to it so we can get on other things. Well, listen, I'd love to have you back on sometime. Maybe even have another smart PhD type person and not have an argument, but let's get through these complexities so people can understand.
Happy to. Just a final thing on the nuclear weapons. Most of the concern about, say, moving to this more tougher position is that, well, Putin will use nuclear weapons. Most of the experts who know anything about nuclear weapons actually say that will never happen. There's no military advantage in using tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield. And secondly, the US has already stated that it will use conventional, not nuclear, conventional weapons to destroy the Russian army in Ukraine if that were to happen. And there are US senators on both sides of the divide, Republicans and Democrats, who have said that if Russia did something like that, or if Russia tampered with the nuclear power station, the biggest nuclear power station in Europe is in Zaporizhia, which Russians occupy. If they try to do a dirty bomb there, then we should understand that as leading to an attack on NATO, because radiation coming from that nuclear plant will flow into NATO member countries. And so, the US has said that, probably more privately than openly, but that should be more openly stated. I mean, the Russian army, and just one final thing to the sort of the Trump wing of the Republican Party. What is happening in Ukraine is costing the US peanuts in terms of your overall military budget. And at the same time, Ukraine is destroying the Russian army and therefore doing a job for you guys and for NATO, meaning the Russian army will no longer be a threat to the US and NATO for at least another decade. Because the Russian army has lost so much in Ukraine. For example, over 2,000 tanks. Can you believe it?
And people that drive those tanks are gone. All of that capacity, whatever level it was, it's gone. They're not going to get that back for 2 decades.
So for on a very small military support to Ukraine, small proportionally compared to the entire US military budget, it's quite small. The feedback for the US and for NATO is massive. Because Russia is now militarily a dwarf compared to what it was, that will allow you to fully then focus on China and the Far East.
Or just home. Let's just stay home and let's deal with our homeless problem, and let's get folks to not die from
China will be less willing to do anything vis-a-vis Taiwan because they've seen what the hell the West can do in Ukraine.
Yeah. All right, man. I'm gonna turn this thing off. Hang around. I'll say goodbye to you proper, but let me run the credits. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to. Curated